All right. And hello to all of you out there in podcast world. This is the Front Row Network. I'm your host, Brandon Davis, and this is our most recent episode of Front Row Classics. And it's been a while since we've been with you all. This is the time of year when a lot of us in the front row are involved in a lot of local theater and stuff like that. So that's been keeping a lot of our schedules busy, but it's good to be back here. And I have with me here Lou, who hasn't been on since January. Hey, Lou.
Hey, how's it going?
Not too bad. How have you been?
I'm doing well. I'm very pleased to be back once again talking about quality films with high acclaim.
We get you a little out of guilty pleasure world.
Yeah.
Awesome. And today we are talking about, it's been a while since we've gone into the 70s, and we've waited long enough. This movie has been talked about on the podcast before in one of Craig's Dishes shows that he did, I think like 2 years ago, but it's long overdue to be talked about on Classics. We're talking about The Godfather from 1972, and we're finally completing the trifecta of what many people consider to be the three greatest movies. Jeremy and I talked about Casablanca early on. We just talked about Citizen Kane in January, and so it's finally time to talk about the third one here, The Godfather. And I'm excited about it. It's been a long time since I've watched it, because it's not one of the movies I tend to go back to a whole lot, but I'm always struck every time I watch it. So Lou, I want to get your first impressions of The Godfather. We're going to give a lot of impressions in this episode.
Yeah, this has a similar story to when we did Citizen Kane, in that once I started really getting into movies after, about high school, probably 15, 16 years old, I grew up loving movies and decided I needed to go back a little bit and watch some of the movies that I kept hearing bandied about as the greatest of all time. So this was, I think, the first one that I went to, because I was a fan of mob movies, because I was a fan of Al Pacino. It had more people I knew and I was familiar with. So it was kind of my conduit to the world of classic American cinema. And unlike Citizen Kane, which I described as having an eating my vegetables kind of vibe, this hooked me from minute one.
Sure.
I thought it was brilliant and beautiful. And I then, after I rented it, I went and purchased the double-decker VHS tape of it and wore that out until the DVD came out, and then the Blu-ray came out. And so I have watched this movie so many more times than I can think. So it's stuck with me for over 25 years probably at this point.
It's one of those pieces that really, when you watch it, you feel like you've watched more than a movie. It's really where cinema really translates into art. And this came at such an important turning point in movie history. It had been going on since kind of the late 60s, but this kind of new wave where the studio system had crumbled. Everybody was now sort of on their own. You still had the big studios, but independent stories that would have never flown 20, 30 years before that were finally getting pushed to the forefront. Mario Puzo's novel, if you had marched into Louis B. Mayer's office in 1948, you probably would have gotten punched in the face.
This movie is not Hays Code friendly at all.
No. Not at all. But it's just an amazing feat, and it really sort of is the jumping point for the few years in the 70s that we get before the blockbuster era comes in, when really gritty, tough, and yet at the same time really artistic stories are coming in. I was thinking, watching it, had a story like this been made 30 years before, it would have been your stereotypical gangster movie with a bunch of shoot 'em ups and everything, and you really wouldn't have delved so much into the character aspect of it. But it set the tone for so much of what was to come.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because it does remind me, the other thing that happened in that time period when the studios are collapsing, the studios existed, but now they were being run by people who didn't know really what they were doing with movies, they knew business. And so then they get these young bucks, or these, these hotshot directors and producers, the film school generation coming up and giving them the keys to the kingdom. And you get producers like Robert Evans, who kind of spearheads a lot of stuff. And it's a great time, because it's the first time that artistic envelope really has opened up. Not to say that there aren't great films pre this era, but this era of film, I feel, is maybe the most influential on the films that we still watch today.
Right. You can totally see where, this is a movie. I couldn't believe it when I was thinking about how this movie came out in 72. This movie's almost 50 years old.
Holy cow.
It's so hard. It'll be 50 years old in 2022, which isn't that far away.
Wow, that's
it's amazing. But how we're still seeing remnants of this movie everywhere. And of course, the actors who got their start in this movie have continued on and are still working, even if they're not quite at their peak hours anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really amazing, because you see where some of the masters of that first generation of cinema, like Alfred Hitchcock and John Ford, how they influenced the filmmakers of this era that we're talking about now. And then now the filmmakers from this era of the 70s have really influenced the filmmakers of this. So it's just a constant sort of succession. But this movie really, I think it blends a lot of what made movies great before that, and it blends a lot of the grittiness of what it is, especially in the way it's shot and in the way the story's told. It's just a beautiful narrative.
It is. And what's interesting too, I was looking this up while we were talking, is that this is also more than just some like art piece. This was a mega hit.
Yeah.
It was the highest grossing movie of 1972. For when you adjust it for inflation, it's the 25th highest grossing movie of all time.
That's amazing.
Which for a rated R 3-hour movie is impressive, to say the least. But yeah, I think the other part about that generation is that they call them the film school generation, but really, to me, it's the first generation of filmmakers that grew up watching movies.
Right.
Is that the industry itself had only been around. The American film industry had only been around 40 50 years at this point. And so there's not a huge well to draw on for those early pioneers of cinema. But then you get a few greats, as you mentioned, that then influence the next generation. And then they're the ones who now are still influencing directors today. And many of them of that generation are still working today, because they were that's the other bonkers thing to think about, that this movie's 50 years old, but many of the directors from that generation are still working because they were so young when they got into the business.
Absolutely. And what's interesting as well is it's amazing just how many careers just came to sort of this apex at this point in time. You have Brando kind of as the looming figure of the movie, even though really he's not the main character, but he's always the one that gets the most recognition in this first movie. But you have all these young bucks underneath him in this movie that are coming up, and it's just amazing when you just look at to see Pacino, Duvall, James Caan, Diane Keaton, all these people in the same movie who are still around, still working. It's really just astounding.
It is. And to think where they went and where their careers went, and how many of them became that, hashtag iconic people. Pacino, and I mean, Brando was iconic even going into this. This just solidifies it. But Diane Keaton's one of the most recognizable actresses of all time, and to see all of those people in a movie and think at the time that they were not well known. Like when I watched it as a like, oh, this is but that was not the case in 72.
Right. Right, absolutely. So let's kind of move on here. I don't think it's that necessary to give a whole plot synopsis for this movie. I think
No.
if you haven't watched this movie in the last 46, 47 years, get with it first of all.
Yeah. Spoiler
But
alert
it's
for everything coming
it's
ahead then.
but it really is the story of Michael Corleone, and it's sort of the whole trilogy is, and then I'm sure we'll allude to the later movies at some point in this podcast. Of course, I'd like to do a whole one on part two at
Sure.
some point, but it really is about this sort of young army war hero, who this clean cut guy who really doesn't want to be part of the family business, which is
Mhm.
mafia, and he's sort of doing everything he can to separate it, and yet, one of the themes of the movie, family, just somehow comes around to bite you, and
Mhm.
you get caught up in this world, and of course he becomes the one thing he doesn't want to be, and
Mhm.
and of course the whole trilogy is about his story and his parallels to his father and all of that. But
Mhm.
let's we'll talk about Brando second, but let's start with the character of Michael Corleone, and let's start with Pacino. Watching this again, it Pacino has kind of become such a caricature of
Mhm.
himself in the past decade, and with all the different impersonations people do of him and everything. It's
Mhm.
so interesting to go back and see him in '72 to see what made Pacino Pacino, and this
Mhm.
was a revolutionary performance. And Pacino can do more just sitting there than most actors can do with a whole monologue.
Mhm. It's really amazing. And what's also amazing is I thought about this. Dick Tracy is 1990,
Yeah,
and that's kind of the line of demarcation, I think, between the Pacino that was and the Pacino that is.
yeah.
And Pacino gives some great performances in the past 20 the years since.
Oh yeah.
There are plenty of great movies out there with Pacino. He wins an Oscar to, for Scent of a Woman and all that.
Mhm.
But it's mind-boggling to think that there's a whole group of people that have lived their entire lives in this era of Pacino and
Mhm.
maybe haven't seen that performance because it's so beautifully understated and it's so far removed from what we've known in the past few decades as Pacino, that's just insane. I think he only actually yells twice in the film,
Yeah,
and both times he only yells like one word.
I know.
So if you want a Pacino, see what Pacino sounds like when he's not screaming. This is the movie.
Yeah, and it's just amazing to see him. I'm like, it's so interesting in in the wedding scenes to see Pacino as this clean cut war hero, because that's not at all what we think of him now, and to see him interact with Diane Keaton's Kay in those first few scenes, and to see him, in the scenes where he's submitting to Brando, and it's really really amazing, and just in some of those, to use Jeremy's word, iconic, to use to view some of those scenes, like when he kills McCluskey and Salazzo in the Italian restaurant, just the precision of his body language and his movement, to see this guy finally, who never thought he would, stoop to what his family does, to finally enter that world. It's just amazing.
What strikes me the most about it is his eye contact in the film.
Yes.
In the first scene when we meet him, he's telling these stories and he's with Kay, he's with his girlfriend, and
Hmm.
he never really looks her in the eye. He's very kind
No.
of sheepish when he talks. He's just kind of
Hmm.
he's telling these stories kind of offhandedly, and he's, and it's kind of it's a great indicator for the character that he is in that moment,
Hmm.
and his kind of humble war hero, kid that made good coming home and is kind of embarrassed about his family.
Hmm.
And then midway, when you mentioned the Salazzo scene, he's working really hard to maintain eye contact, or Michael is.
Yes.
I don't want to say Pacino. I want to say Michael is trying
Hmm.
to make sure that he's like, oh, this is the first time I'm in this world. I need, like, you see his eyes kind of like bugging out a little bit.
Hmm.
And then you get to the last act of the film, and he just stares daggers through everybody.
Yes, he does.
The gaze that he has is so
Hmm.
powerful. So you could just watch stills of him throughout the movie and get his character arc, just in that, and that's such a subtle thing to do. It's not this big showy performance. There's
Right.
no line where he's like, I'm a changed man or anything like that. You just see all of that. And it's
Mhm.
such a great performance, and it's an amazing character arc.
Mhm.
Uh,
For for me, the real turn, I think, when watching it this time, I always am. Every time I watch it, I'm like, okay, when exactly does Michael turn?
mhm,
At one point, and I always feel like it's sort of that scene when he and I think it's Enzo when they're standing outside of the hospital when
mhm,
and the thugs come by and they're pretending to be Vito's bodyguards
mhm,
and you see I think Vito's not Vito Enzo's pretty much shaking and Michael is as still as could be
mhm,
and and you sort of see that turn especially after he's just told his dad I'm with you
mhm.
it really that's sort of for me when Michael really starts to become the Don at that point.
Yeah, and I thought the same thing too. And the other thing that I thought, to go back to what you were talking about, the theme, which I think we'll hit on
Mhm.
several times, about turning into your parents or turning,
Yeah,
maturing. There is that moment that all of us, I think, are going to have, or if you haven't had at some point in adulthood, when an emergency strikes and you are the one who's now going to have to be the one that's calm under pressure
right.
because your family needs you to be. Now,
Hmm.
his is a little bit of a different scenario than what we would find ourselves in, but
Yeah.
you know, everybody has those things in their family, health scares or whatever, that you have to be the one. And it's that moment. I think you're exactly right, where he's realizing, oh, no one else is around at this moment. I have
Hmm.
to take command of the situation.
Yeah.
And once he does, that's kind of he was forced to do it because no one was there, and then he gets hit by the cop, and now he's
Hmm.
got a little taste of vengeance, which is another recurring theme of this film. But
Right.
yeah, I'm with you. I think that's a good it's a good turning point. It's a good moment
Yeah.
to point out there.
Yeah. He's just. I mean that whole arc that he makes. Of course, he makes this arc throughout the whole trilogy, and in
Mhm,
part two, you can argue even more of an arc.
mhm,
But it's he's really really phenomenal. And of course, we'll get to specific scenes here a little later. But let's move on to the the original Don himself, Vito Marlon
mhm.
Brando. Um, it's so interesting to watch Brando early in his career versus later in his career. When you see him in Waterfront and Streetcar Named Desire, and even something like Guys and Dolls, and you see this almost manic presence that he has, and then to see him at this point when he's doing Godfather, he's not quite into his lazy Brando yet. He's not quite Superman or Apocalypse Now Brando. But
Although he did famously still have his lines taped to his
yes,
co-stars
he
in this
did.
film, so he's he's starting to turn the corner.
Yeah, but his presence looms large in this movie, and you can't deny it. There's some people who, no matter, even if they're not trying, you put a camera in front of them, and they're going to radiate,
Mhm,
and that's what he does. And it's almost weird to say that he's this sort of moral patriarch, but that's what he comes across as in this
mhm.
movie because he has he kills people, but he won't go into the narcotics business because he has his moral standards.
Right, and he won't even kill somebody
Right,
unless it's retaliatory.
right.
That opening scene, which
Oh,
we could talk for hours on that
yeah.
one, just that scene alone. But he talks about, and that was the moment I actually remembered watching when I was a kid,
Hmm.
of thinking, oh, this movie's going to be a little different than what I think, because the line of "That's not justice, your daughter is still alive," when
Right.
the Undertaker wants him to murder the men who beat up his wife. He's like, no, that's not justice. That's not the same. So yeah, there is that moral code that he has,
Hmm.
and it's the kind of that through line through the movie
Hmm.
of he's the one who kind of resists the changing times, which is yet another great analogy to, father-son relationships, is,
Right.
Brando being a product of his time and Michael being a product of his, and how things change.
Well, and it's interesting, this movie starts in 1945. So we're talking about now post World War II America. And that decade, the decade that this movie goes from 45 to 55, was such an interesting changing time, because you have, Vito sort of represents the pre-World War II world, which, was a little more, had a little more, I almost want to say style to it, where a little more manners, and you do everywhere. Whereas Michael represents this sort of post World War II world where we're a little more cynical, where we're still the world still holds these conservative values, but there's this underbelly that's burning underneath that is wanting to come out. So it's really it's the old world versus the new world too. But yeah, it's just and when I was watching again, one of the scenes with Brando that always gets me is after Sonny's killed, and he's in the morgue, and what did they do to my boy? They killed my boy. You feel that, even for this guy who might necessarily have always wanted to be there at the moment. He does give it his all.
It does, yeah. And the anguish that you see on his face is so palpable. And the other moment that he has kind of the similar face, the similar anguish, is when he is told that Michael was the one that kills the cop. And that he's like, and that foreshadows the moment he has in his last scene with Pacino, where he admits he didn't want this for Michael. He thought that Michael was better than this and would be better than this. And so there's again that parents and children relationship where, every parent wants their child to do better than they did. And the pain of maybe seeing, well, this didn't happen, and it didn't happen really for any of his kids, which is the kind of the sadness that he carries with him.
Well, let's move on now to one of the other sons. Let's move on to James Caan as Sonny. And every family has their hothead, and he's just great. James Caan's another one who's kind of, and within the last decade, he hasn't become as much of a caricature as Pacino, but he's kind of gone into these really gritty older guy roles, and to see him as this young hothead is really cool. And James Caan had so much charisma in those days. It's amazing to watch.
I think he's become more of a caricature in real life than he has on screen, but that's maybe a separate podcast. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I even the scene where he's beating up Carlo for beating up Connie, just the rage, even though that fight comes across now as a little fake at times, but he, the whole performance, and you see why Sonny could never be the Godfather at any point. He thinks with his heart too much over his head.
He thinks with something else too from time to time.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned that the scene where he beats up Carlo, and there's a few punches that don't land in the beginning, which is kind of quaint, but then there are some kicks that 100% land, because the actor who plays Carlo actually sustained cracked ribs from that scene. So, he was, this was the time where method acting was really in vogue, and he went for it on that. Yeah, he is such a charismatic presence, and you do kind of forget, if you've only seen older James Caan, that that this makes a lot of sense. And he was one who I think was a bigger star in the 70s, and whose star kind of faded over time, because he ends up going on and having he was originally tapped to be Rocky. Before Stallone stepped in and put the kibosh on that, but they wanted him because he was such a intense, charismatic presence.
Absolutely, and And of course he gets the most. In my opinion, he does get the most dramatic. Well, I guess Apollonia gets the most dramatic death, but he does get the most, the loudest death, almost, getting riddled with Tommy guns.
Yeah.
But yeah, every anytime he walks on screen, though, you just have to pay attention.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the details in this story are another thing that make the film great. And the fact that, yeah, they pull out all the stops to kill this dude because they
Right.
know, like, you could shoot him once and he is going to keep coming at you. It's a precursor to a lot of, and we talk about how influential it is. It's a precursor to a lot of the characters we'd see Joe Pesci play in the Scorsese films. Of like, this dude's freaking nuts and you need to bring an army to stop him, but he's got a weakness. He's got that Achilles heel, and the movie does such a great job of showing you that instead of telling you that, because we see the scene with Carlo sets up his death scene, because they now realize, oh, he'll go off the deep end when he hears his sister's getting hurt, and he won't wait for anybody, and we can use that.
Right. Absolutely.
So he gets outgunned and outsmarted in that.
Yes, he does. And the one person who always tries to talk him down, of course, is Tom Hagen, played by Robert Duvall. And I'm a big Robert Duvall fan. You think about Robert Duvall's career, from playing Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird all the way through what he's done recently. But I was reading just a few things before we did this, and I was reading Roger Ebert's essay about this movie in the Great Movies book that he did. And he said, I've become so aware of the movie business, being a critic and everything. He said, it's rare when I get lost in a character and I forget who the actor is. But he said The Godfather is one of those. And he said and he mentions Duvall specifically. He said, every time I watch it, I don't think there's Duvall. I think there's Tom Hagen, because Duvall just makes that character so real, who's kind of on the outside, but more inside than anybody almost.
Yeah, I think it may be the most underrated of the performances,
right?
Because we do hear, I think, of the three that we've already mentioned, and even we kind of are doing it for a bit because we're getting to him fourth, but it's so it's another, again, understated, and again, Duvall's a guy very similar to these other guys who's gotten more known for his more grizzled persona, but to see him so fresh faced, and I would point out, he is the character who has the most exposition in the movie, and he handles it so well. He's so effortless and natural that it doesn't feel like he's explaining things to you, but he's as that role, which is another, it's just it's a great way to present exposition. And I talk about that in my class a lot when we talk about scripts, and every movie has exposition, and you can tell a good screenwriter from a great screenwriter by how they handle it. And they create this character of Tom, who's so great at giving you the information, but still giving you a real character.
Absolutely. And his scenes and the Hollywood scenes with him and Waltz, he's so good in those, because he's just, he's as straight as an arrow. But that it's not going to look good for Waltz in the end, just because Hagen's going to go back to his boss and everything. But Duvall just plays it so straight and everything. And like you said, I was going to say too, the exposition of it. There's always that one character that does it, and because Duvall is such a thoughtful actor, he gives you exposition with making it sound almost spontaneous, without it even it even sounding like it was written or planned. And that's the gift of a really good actor. And he's another one that people sort of forget. He was at the top of his game at this time.
And he's so and he has a kindness to him in this movie that no one else in that family has. And it's ironic, because he's the one who's adopted, so he's not in the bloodline, that he lacks maybe the killer instinct, but he's got more of the human touch. So when he gets the famous "You're out, Tom" line, you see that it hurts him, but at the same time, he doesn't allow himself to get intimidated. I noticed again today the scene where Waltz is yelling at him and like getting in his face, and he's he's just straight as an arrow, just calm, steady as a rock, just like letting it go.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's we've sort of talked about the four main players in this thing, but let's get into some of the minor, and we don't have to go into, because we'll talk more about scenes involving some of these people. But it's so interesting to me when I watch Diane Keaton in this movie pre Annie Hall, because once she did Annie Hall 5 years later, she sort of became this sort of queen of comedy. And so to see her as a dramatic actress, which she didn't do too much after Annie Hall, is really, really interesting, because she's so good and she's so convincing in this part. And it's funny sometimes when you think about Diane Keaton, you almost forget The Godfather is in her filmography, because you think of her so much in this zany persona that she's created for herself.
Yeah, it's really divorced from the rest of her filmography, but it's essential because it makes her the star. It makes her the star that she is, and helps her get discovered. And it's a great use of her, because she does have what makes her such a great romantic comedy actress is there's a sweetness to her and a likability that works so well for this character in this world, that she is, again, much like Tom, which is why I liked one of my favorite understated scenes is the scene between the two of them, of the kind of the two people that are not in this bloodline, but are kind of like being forced into this world, that she's got this humanity to her that's effortless.
Yeah, and of course we get to see more of her in the second movie. She gets more of an arc in the second movie, but yeah, and the other major female, of course, you mentioned Rocky earlier, but Talia Shire is Connie. She doesn't get a whole lot to do, but she's such an essential part of the puzzle because of everything to do with Carlo, and she gets a little more to do, of course, in the subsequent movies as well. But it's interesting to see a pre-Rocky Talia Shire too, who's part of these, two essential film franchises of the 70s.
Yeah, it's amazing because both of those are on my top 5 favorite films.
Yeah.
Rocky and The Godfather, and she's like the thread with that, which is, when I think of my favorite actresses, I don't think of Talia Shire, even though she's very talented, but yet here she has this essential place in 2 of my favorite films, 2 favorite film franchises.
Right. And then of course the other brother who always kind of gets the raw end of the deal, Fredo, played by John Cazale, but he does his job. As an actor, he does his job great. I mean, and the scenes with Mo Green, he just he plays the brother without a backbone so well.
Now, I had a question about that, maybe because I didn't get a chance to look this up before we got on here. Godfather 2, was that at least written, or was it written by the time this movie is in production? Or
I haven't really done a ton of but with Godfather 2 coming out only 2 years later, I'm assuming that at least the main story arcs were already put in place by that time.
Because
it would have to have been,
because if it wasn't, it was maybe certainly inspired by that scene and the line that Michael has of "Don't ever take sides against the family again." And we see in Godfather, spoiler alert for Godfather Part 2, that's the main crux of that film, is where his story goes. And so for him, I think, we could talk later about 1 versus 2, and I know there's some debate, but I would argue the best character evolution between the 2 films is maybe that of Fredo. And the one that would make 2 essential viewing, even though I already think it is. But what I love about him is the first time we meet Fredo is he's drunk at the wedding.
Oh yeah.
And it lets you, again, this movie's so good at showing you who these people are rather than telling you, because here he comes in and he's a little handsy with Kay and he's mumbling, and you can tell he's had a little too much to drink and there's something just a little off. And like Michael is just so patient with him. It's just like, oh, it's okay. You're fine. It's, and it reminds me of, not to get on a tangent, of SNL's portrayal of the Trump sons,
Yes.
Eric and Don Jr.
Almost. It really does. But
But it's just he's so good.
mhm.
He's so great, and he's great in both of these films, portraying the character that's just the black sheep of the family.
Right, right. We've discussed now sort of the all the main members of the family, and of course the rest of the cast are all of the lieutenants and henchmen and everything. Do you have a particular one that stands out to you?
Who doesn't love Abe Vigoda?
Oh, I love Ed Vigoda.
and and it was that's again another one of those. I think of all the shocking revelations is to see him in this film. If were a 90s kid and you grew up watching Conan O'Brien, or
Yeah.
the references to him, or his kind of the niche he found himself in his later years.
Well, he became about I would say 5 or 6 years after this, he became a sitcom star.
Right.
With Barney Miller.
Mm-hmm.
So a total turn, yeah.
Yeah, and to see that is great. And he's he looked like an 80-year-old man 50 years ago.
He did.
He's just perpetually old looking. But I like him, and both Tessio and Clemenza are both great secondary characters, and we learn enough about them to know who they are too.
Yeah.
That wedding sequence really not introduces you to all of the characters, not just like the main 2 or 3, but you see them in their environment, and you learn everything you need to know about them.
Yeah. And I also love Luca Brasi. The scene where he's rehearsing his speech before going in to talk to the Don. That says so much, and it's a great moment for Michael and Kay also to recognize what's going on and everything. Of course, he doesn't get a very fun death either. But,
no, he doesn't.
But yeah, this whole movie is cast with people that you remember. They all have such a memorable face, and it's and Alex Rocco is Mo Green. He's got such an interesting look too.
He does, and I love it because in other movies he is a tough guy.
Yeah,
but in this he's a character who's trying to be a tough guy, and I love that. I love the line where he's like, "I'm Mo Green. I made my bones when you were going out with cheerleaders," and it's like, you are so out of your depth, my friend, in this situation. You are.
I know.
You are no threat to this man, and he's like Michael's just no selling it, and it's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to the cast. From the cast, let's just talk about favorite scenes. And I mean, we could do a whole podcast on just one scene probably, but you mentioned it before. But the opening scene, just when it fades to black and you hear that voice say, "I believe in America," and the lights come up, and I'll talk a little bit about the cinematography and everything later, but just a brilliant opening scene, and it really plays into a different part of the American mythos than most people were used to in the movies back then.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it lets you know right off the bat that this is the story in many ways. It's the story of immigrants.
Yeah.
Which they dive deeper into in the second film, but that opening monologue is about an immigrant who comes to this country and tries to play by the rules and realizes that the American rules are not always fair. Right. And so here he comes to the one man who's been able to make a life by not playing by the rules, which again is something you couldn't do in a film, 2 decades prior. You couldn't make your one of your protagonists, arguably, this guy who makes a living and makes a kingdom out of not playing by the rules.
Absolutely. And just every moment of that first scene with Vito and Bonacera is every bit of that dialogue is memorable. I mean, everyone remembers, stuff like "I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse" and all of that. But but everything that they say, it's just Mario Puzo. It's poetry. And it's absolutely amazing, and to see that even in this world of wrongdoing, there's this moral code, and it's just amazing to watch. And of course, another famous sequence early on in the movie for me is and it's been done to death and parodied, but the horse's head.
Mm-hmm.
But talk about a sequence that just talks about the power that this family has. I mean, you would think a Hollywood mogul like that, just think of all the security he would have around his house and everything, and you would think, okay, the Corleone family has paid off his security team. They've gotten in, they've murdered his horse, and they've gotten that into his bed. They must have drugged him at some point so that he wouldn't know. So when you just think about all that, everyone remembers that moment. When you think about what goes into that moment, it's really amazing.
It shows their power. It shows, they can go, they do whatever they want, and they can get to anybody. But again, they don't kill him.
Right.
He turns them down. Yeah. They're like, okay, well, we'll chop the head off a horse. That's fine. But they're going to get what they want, and they do, because ultimately Johnny gets the picture. And I'm sure you're probably aware, maybe some of our listeners are too, but that whole subplot, that whole story is allegedly based on a true story. That is,
I've heard a little bit. Yeah.
So the character of Johnny Fontaine is allegedly based off of Frank Sinatra, and the war picture that they're referencing is not on the. I don't want to say on the waterfront.
From Here to Eternity.
From Here to Eternity. Thank you. Yes, and so he and Frank Sinatra famously sang with a band when he first made his career before he broke out solo. So, and there's always been these urban myths about Frank Sinatra having mob ties. And so this movie crystallizes that by putting it in a movie, allegedly.
Which Sinatra was not happy about when he heard all of it.
I can imagine he would be.
And Sinatra was not one you wanted to mess with.
No, but, for that exact reason.
Yeah, because I think I read the part of Johnny Fontaine was supposed to be somewhat bigger, but when they had heard that Sinatra got wind of it, they really lessened it and really just made it that much more. But there's always been that, and of course, the mob ran Vegas in those early days, so any entertainer who was performing in Vegas would have come in contact with somebody at some point.
Right. And so the whole Rat Pack is, they knew some people. I mean, how much they were involved is not, I guess we'll leave to another day.
Absolutely. Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
But what's interesting about the scenes that we're talking about here, both the horse's head scene and everything that leads up to that, the wedding scene, the speech, none of that really contributes to the plot of the film, which is such a great, I think, people talk about the length of movies or whatever, and some movies are too long or whatever, but this movie is so essential it's so essential that this movie has to be 3 hours.
Right.
Because without it, you don't get scenes like that. And I wrote it down. The wedding sequence is the first 28 minutes of the film, and the horse's head sequence is another 6 minutes. So we're a half hour in before we even find out what the plot of this movie is going to be.
Right.
But it's such great character work.
And that whole wedding sequence, it's such a unique look into Italian culture. And of course, with Francis Ford Coppola being the director who grew up in that culture, it feels authentic. I know the movie gets criticized sometimes, and I read about playing to Italian stereotypes, but I'm like, you have a real Italian directing this and giving you authentic stuff. So I never quite understood those criticisms.
I think if anything, this movie created stereotypes rather than embrace them. Right. I think it seems like, what order did you watch these in, or when did you see this? Because I don't think this certainly wasn't hitting on any stereotypes at the time.
No.
And anything that's happened after that is because this movie was such a cultural touchstone.
Right, absolutely. And it's funny. And you mentioned when people parody this movie, when they talk about certain scenes from this movie, it's usually lines and things that don't have to do with the plot. I mean, take the gun, leave the cannoli. I mean, it's that's the beginning of the plot, but that's a scene. That's this inconsequential scene, but it's filmed so wonderfully with the wheat flowing in the background and everything. It's just it's just absolutely amazing. What's another scene that sticks out to you?
All of them are so great. I think the scene at the end where Michael is grilling Carlo
Yeah.
he's like, I know it. I know what happened. Don't outsmart me. I figure that moment where it's he is fully in command of the situation. And it's the first time we get to see him work after his father's death. So, spoiler alert. But that he's fully in command of the situation, and he's so just stone cold.
Yeah.
To him. And then in the following sequence to Kay, when Kay asks him, he goes, "Okay, I'll let you ask me." And he asks, and he just straight up lies to her. And it's such a great contrast to who he was in the beginning, that I think it's arguably the best character arc in American cinema.
Right. Well, and you've gotten to that final scene, and talk about such a great final shot with the door shutting on Diane Keaton's face. Just like you said, a complete 180 from where we were, and such a harbinger of what's to come in Godfather 2. Absolutely amazing. And I was also thinking, when you were talking about Vito dying, I was like, it's so interesting that he gets probably the most, not peaceful, but natural death in the movie. And he's dying, chasing his grandchild around, and having this stroke. But that scene's so artfully done. I mean, when that shot of him lying there, that's almost like a painting. Just absolutely amazing. Yeah. These little moments.
Yeah, two things about that. One is when you get the DVD or Blu-ray of the film.
That's the menu.
That's the menu. Which is such an odd choice, but I'm guessing because it's like, yeah, that's a really beautiful shot. Yeah. I guess, okay, of all the things, that's the menu. And it's if you've never seen it, this is your first time you pop it in, it's like you have no idea what you're seeing, but it's a giant ass spoiler. And then the other thing about it wasn't originally written into the film.
No.
Vito was supposed to die off screen of natural causes. Again, nothing real spectacular about it. But Brando kind of demanded and had the pull to do something. It's like, well, they had an afternoon to shoot it, and he's like, well, I play this game with my, I don't know if it was his kids or his grandkids. He wouldn't have had grandkids at the time, but here's this little game that I play, and we can do it, and then he can just kind of keel over. Which and it's another iconic moment of and just a very such a low key way for this guy to go out, and but he wins in that regard, is that no one ever was able to take him down.
He does. The other scenes that stood out to me this time watching it were the scenes in Sicily when Michael runs away. They're so contrary to everything else you see in the movie. Everything's got this bleak brown and yellowish tint to it. And then you see the beauty of the Italian countryside and everything, and it's such a stark contrast. And of course, so interesting to see Michael falling in love with Apollonia, and the development of that, and of course the way that she dies is so gruesome. But yeah, once again such an interesting contrast, and of course that sort of plays into the bits of Italy that we get in the next movie and all of that. So that's interesting to watch as well.
And the impact that has on Michael, where I think you could argue, I don't believe when he goes back to Kay, he is in love with Kay anymore. I don't think he goes back to her because he loves her. I think she's in many ways his rebound,
right?
But in other ways too, like a necessary part of his empire, which is to have a wife and raise the next generation of this family. And so when if one of the criticisms you hear about the film is those sequences,
Yeah.
and that because they are a little disconnected from the forward motion of the plot, but it's so crucial to his character, and the fact that there's this glimmer of hope where if he just stays there, he could get away.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, the other famous sequence we have to discuss is, of course, the baptism sequence, where all the 5 families are done away with, while Michael is becoming a literal godfather. Just the whole Coppola films that it's like a ballet. I mean, the way it's shot. I mean, the way it keeps flashing back and forth and everything, and it's so well done, and how perfectly everything falls into place. And just once again, Pacino's just stone cold looks during that whole thing, juxtaposed with all the killings that are going on. Mo Green getting shot in the eye. It's all just beautifully done.
Yeah, and he knows clearly what's happening while this is going on, but he's still going to stand up there and in this religious holy place and profess renouncing Satan. Do you renounce Satan of all his works? I do. Boom, boom, boom. It's just great storytelling, and to show that the gutting of his soul that has happened at this point and gets taken to further depths in the future films. But yeah, it's so artfully done, and it's interesting because this movie obviously has a lot of violence in it, but it's nowhere near the graphic content that we would see coming up. But the one that gets me is Mo Green getting shot in the eye, and then the little blood. There's like that little second delay. It's like, did he? Oh yeah, he did, and then it just starts gushing.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we transition on, any other scenes that stick out to you?
No, I think we covered it.
We covered most of the famous ones. Yeah. Really, before our final discussion, I think is going to be about its place among movies and its influence. But I want to talk about just themes, and I know people argue about the theme of this a lot. And we've talked about how you become your parents, and the theme of family and loyalty. Do you think that's the theme that's really at the center of this?
Yeah, it's the one. It's the one that keeps me back to the movie. It's the one that I find most intriguing, because I do think, there are plenty of movies out there about crime. There's plenty of movies out there about the mafia. But what this movie I do think really is about is finding your own identity while dealing with the identity of your family, and how much are you yourself versus, what you are, what your parents have influenced you to be. And yeah, just the family dynamic, and the extended family dynamic, which is the other thing I think we kind of talked about when we talked about the characters, is you've got the black sheep, the hothead, the stable one. Ironically, Fredo was the oldest of the family.
I know.
And you've got the little, and there's that famous line in part 2 where he's like, I'm your older brother and you take care of me. And it's like, there's that weird dynamic of, well, just because you're the oldest one in the family doesn't mean you're the most mature. And those ideas really, I think, just resonate every single time that you go back to it.
Yeah. And there's you think about other mobster movies that followed, like ones that Scorsese did and everything, and they're so I love Goodfellas, but there's a much more fast-paced, cynical. This is a movie that takes its time telling the story, and there's this melancholy to it, sort of punctuated by Nino Rota's score. The music in this movie is wonderful. But yeah, just the theme of how you can try and run away from your roots, but one of the best story arcs in all the decades. You see it immediately after in movies like one of my we've done a podcast about this already. One of my favorite movies of the 70s, Chinatown, which is more of an acquired taste than this movie for some people. but produced by the same guy, Robert Evans.
Mhm.
And you see it, in the work that Nicholson does, like Cuckoo's Nest, and you see it. Everything becomes just a little darker, a little grittier.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does. It is a little. It's darker, and it's things get darker. But one of the things that this movie does have are those moments of joy.
Yes.
The wedding sequence,
Yeah.
and to go back to it, and what's great about it is the constant back and forth between the darkness of what's going on in Vito's office versus all of this happy, fun joy. And you can make an argument that that moment, the family picture, is like the last moment
Right.
that the family is happy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like there, because everything just is going to go to hell for pretty much for everyone in that picture, one way or another.
Yeah, we get that. We get that great final scene in part 2 that flashes back to that family dinner, which shows them at a much happier time in their lives. But yeah, absolutely. And as the decades move on, in '75, Jaws comes out, and suddenly things start to change, and we become more blockbuster oriented. And of course, when Star Wars comes out, that cements it. But the influence of Godfather stays in independent movies and other, when you look at movies like, Shawshank Redemption, you see influence from The Godfather. When you look at, of course, a lot of Scorsese's work, Taxi Driver, all that, you see The Godfather's influence, where things are just a little more cynical, a little more melancholy, and yet the human experience is really raised to a level that it had never been before. And it's amazing. 46 years later, we're still seeing it.
Yeah, and I think cynical is a really good word, and I don't think that that's a negative thing necessarily, because I think art should be challenging. I don't think our diet should consist of necessarily one thing, and I think if you just had a steady diet of cynicism, that's necessarily not going to produce great results either. But I think this showed what movies could be, and that movies didn't have to follow the good guy or somebody becoming a good person or a better person. This is the exact opposite. This is a good person becoming an evil person. And you can do a story like that and have really just the same amount of resonance, or maybe even more, because of the tragedy of watching somebody go down the wrong path.
It's interesting. I'm just reading about the release, and it's once again it just flabbergasts me that how much of a hit this was with audiences and how much it did at the box office. And of course, it would hold its record for a couple years, and then of course when Jaws comes out, things change. But nominated for, let's see, nominated for 12 Oscars, and it only won 3. This movie, it won Best Picture, it won actor for Brando. I'll talk about that a little later. And adapted screenplay. The movie that swept the Oscars that year was Cabaret, and which is a movie that I also watched recently and still holds up very well, and is actually almost more relevant today than it was when it came out in '72. But Bob Fosse won Best Director over Coppola. Just really, really interesting how that Cabaret won 8 Oscars, Godfather wins 3.
Wow. Yeah. Certainly no slight to Cabaret as a film, but I think if history is looked a little more favorably on one than the other. And I think then Godfather 2 wins
much more.
Wins much more. But to think that it's weird that Pacino doesn't get an Oscar for anything until Son of a Woman, but especially for this. But the fact he's not, was he up for Best Actor as well then? Because
he was up, actually, all James Caan, Duvall, and Pacino were all up for supporting actor, all 3 of them in the same category.
And I think right there speaks to one of maybe the fundamental misunderstandings of the movie sometimes. is that he is, and some of that can be Hollywood or negotiations or what the
Right.
studio puts you forth that he is not a supporting actor in this. This
Pacino,
is
Pacino boycotted the Oscars that year because he felt he should have been in the lead.
Yeah, he should have been. He is the lead.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I had a student in my class, one of the joys in my class is watching these people discover these films for the first time.
Mhm.
And one of my students came up to me and is like, can a movie have two protagonists? Because it seems like this movie's about both Pacino or about Vito and Michael. And I said, well, I would argue that we learn a lot about Vito, but his story by this, is the story. Who does the story belong to? And it really does belong to Michael. So that's
his story actually becomes more fleshed out in part 2 when De Niro's playing that character.
Yes.
So, and of course, De Niro won the Oscar for part 2, but yeah, really, and of course, Brando wins. Didn't accept it. That's the one of the most awkward moments in Oscar history when this Native American woman comes on stage and refuses the Oscar and gets booed.
Brando was a weird dude, man.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, interesting, and I don't know if that Oscar ever actually made its way. I think the Academy must still have that Oscar.
Probably.
Somewhere.
Brando was in the early stages of not having any, what's to give.
Yeah, which is interesting because you look 20 years earlier when Brando wins his first Oscar for Waterfront. And there's pictures of him holding it and smiling and everything, and fast forward 20 years later and it's all changed. But yeah, absolutely. And just once again, I said it's interesting the way that time works for movies, and there's some people that feel that part 2 is better than 1, and I wrestle with it because part 2 is such an amazing experience, the way it flashes back, and it's so well done. But when you watch part 1, it's, like I said, just a beautiful classic narrative, and so many amazing little character moments. It's hard to compare, but it's hard to say that part 2 is better than part 1 sometimes.
I would agree with that because I do feel that part 2 exists, and this is the cop out that I'll use. Part 2 has a hard time, I think, existing without part 1.
Yeah.
I think if you never saw part 1 and you watched part 2, you could get it, and I think it would be still a very good movie. But especially in the modern day sequences with Michael, the Vito stuff is fine because you don't necessarily need to know what he becomes, although it helps. It's like a prequel and a sequel at the same time. But to me, number 1 is, for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned, is better. The first one is better than the second because it is its own contained work of art.
Right.
It doesn't need any context.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's it's just amazing. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, we finally recorded now podcasts on the 3 different movies that are usually considered the greatest of all time. And when the much debated American Film Institute list first came out in 1998, you had Godfather at 3, Casablanca at 2, and Citizen Kane at 1. And then when it was revoted on a decade later, Godfather leapfrogged Casablanca and went to number 2, and leaving Kane at number 1. And I was trying to think, okay, now that I've watched all 3 of them recently, where would I put them? And Godfather, when you walk out of it, touches me much more than Citizen Kane does. I think my heart is still Casablanca. I think that really represents the romanticism of going to the movies. I think you have that wonderful arc that Rick has, and it's just these perfect elements blending together. So for me, it would be Casablanca, Godfather, Kane. But it's hard. There's such 3 different works, and they're all they all have such merit on their own prowess. But I think those 3 are always going to be in the conversation.
Yes, as well they should be. I think because I do think all three of them have something unique to offer
Mhm.
to the discussion. I think you can make the argument that Casablanca is the best written of the three in terms of its tight. It has a much tighter narrative
Mhm.
then it's got a great plot structure. As we mentioned about The Godfather, you could see this as a strength or weakness. The fact that it's a 3 hour movie whose plot doesn't begin until a half hour in,
Right.
and then still has that aside to Sicily. So if you're somebody who's like,
Mhm.
well, in terms of just the conciseness of the narrative, Casablanca kind of has it over both of those.
Mhm.
But when you look at the list of characters, the depth
Right.
of each of those characters, and the scope
Mhm.
of the films, I think Godfather wins out over. And frankly, I think it wins out over both of them. For me, I discovered this movie first, so I probably am more sentimental towards it. But I would put this number one,
Mhm.
Casablanca second, and Citizen Kane
Mhm.
third for on a personal
Yeah.
ranking.
Oh, yeah, personal for me too. But wouldn't it be, it wouldn't have been so interesting had Orson Welles gotten his way and played Vito like he wanted to?
Oh yeah, it would be fascinating. He could have done it.
Oh,
I
he
mean,
could have done
I
it.
totally see that.
He could have
Uh,
done it. The whole tone of the movie would have been so different, though.
mhm,
It would have been so interesting. And also, it's interesting that Laurence Olivier also wanted the part of Vito, and
mhm,
that would have been totally different as well. But,
mhm.
but yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely amazing. But it's the Godfather. It's and it's also interesting to me how these three movies also take place kind of at the same period of time, the sort of World War II kind of
Mhm,
era, where Citizen Kane flashes back a lot to different eras, but its present day is that same era.
mhm,
So, and they all sort of tell American stories, these sort of different slices of life, but
mhm.
really, really, really interesting. So yeah, we've covered a lot here for a movie that you could cover even more about
Yeah,
in
I
the
feel
little
like
octagon.
there's so much. You could probably do a whole series. I'm sure somebody out there has of
Absolutely,
just of
absolutely. Well,
breaking down.
and when we finally get to part two, I'm sure there'll be stuff from part one that we'll have forgotten that we'll talk about again.
Mhm.
But Lou, final thoughts about The Godfather before we close out?
I would say if you haven't seen this movie, you absolutely need to, even if this movie doesn't sound like your cup of tea, which is
Mhm.
the other thing. I think we talked about this on the Citizen Kane podcast of how, Casablanca is maybe more of a crowd pleaser of a movie,
Mhm.
which is why I think a lot of people would put it higher than either Godfather or Citizen Kane. But
Mhm.
I do think you owe it to yourself to check this out at least once. And whether, you're not sold on movies about the mob or whatever, understand that it's so much more than that.
Right.
Uh, and for those of you who have seen the film, I highly recommend Robert Evans's autobiography, The Kid Stays in the Picture.
Yes.
And I don't just recommend the book, but I recommend the audiobook because
He's a character.
he is a character. He's a cartoon character. He's like a cartoon supervillain,
Mhm.
and just has some great stories about the making of this movie. That's the other thing we could spend
Oh
a whole
yeah.
hour just talking about the making of this
Mhm.
film, and tell some really great stories. But yeah, I love this movie. I do think it's for me. I think it's the greatest American film ever made, and I am pleased to watch it anytime and talk about it anytime.
Yeah, I can't think of another movie that has told such a unique American story. And I would love it part two. We didn't really mention three, but it's not on the same par. There's some interesting moments in three,
Yeah,
but I want to. Would that count as guilty pleasure part three, or is it's a little more of a higher plane?
I think we could count
Would
it
it?
as because it is not well, the criteria is it's
Yeah,
got to be something that's not well
yeah,
received either by critics or public opinion, and it's
right,
certainly that.
sure.
And on the scope of the other two films, it's certainly not. It doesn't make as much money. It doesn't win as many awards.
Mhm.
It's seen as that might be. We might have to bust that one out at some point.
Yeah, that would be interesting. But yeah, I encourage people. Even if I know certain people would say a mob movie wouldn't be their cup of tea or anything, but it's so much more than that. It's really the story of a family set in this backdrop.
Mhm.
and there's violence in it, but nothing gruesome like you would see today. And it's just well told, and it's a long movie, but when you're engrossed in the story, it doesn't feel like it. When
Mhm.
Jeremy and Sarah and I were talking about Gone with the Wind, which is almost 4 hours,
Oof.
we were saying when you get involved in the action with that, those 4 hours go by like that. It's the same
Mhm.
thing with Godfather.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. And it's
so
so essential. Its length, I think, is
mhm,
essential.
yeah.
It's one of the few movies that at 3 hours, there's not a scene that doesn't
Hmm.
that could get you can you could have trim that a little bit or whatever, but the journey that you go on almost feels like it's a longer movie because of how much the characters change from the beginning of the
Right.
film to the end.
Right, absolutely. So I encourage everyone to watch it. I'm glad we finally got around to it. And thanks, Lou, for
Mhm.
joining me on Classics again. It was fun.
Yeah, thanks.
Um,
Always a
we'll
pleasure. Talk about one of my favorite
I'll
movies.
I'll have to get out of Classics world sometime and get into the Guilty Pleasures world sometime.
I think we need to do that because I've heard from some people that we should do maybe something out of the 70s. We get out of the 80s and 90s and do maybe a 70s guilty pleasure because there are plenty of those.
Oh, plenty. Well, there's guilty pleasures from all decades. I mean,
Mhm.
I think things from the 30s, 40s, and 50s get kind of glossed over with this kind of rose-colored brush, but
Mhm.
there was plenty of junk made in every era of movie
Oh,
making. So
there was tons of junk that in the studio eras they were producing like 4 or 5 movies a week. So
I mean, and plots were recycled over and
yeah,
over
so
again.
it's yeah,
So
there's a lot of crap out there.
it's just not as high profile as
No,
junk from the
exactly.
80s and 90s.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. So we thank you so much for your support here on the Front Row Network. And we uh, we're so glad that you all are listening to our content and everything. I'm glad that finally Classics is back. It's been a little while since I've done one of these. We're going to bring you a couple here in the near future. Keep listening to Zonisode. Scott and I are engrossed in the middle of season 2 with the recording of this. So we'll keep going with that, and Lou with his guilty pleasures, and anything you want to say regarding guilty pleasures?
Sure. If you're depending on when you're listening to this, July's movie was or is Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull.
Oh
We
man.
had we had yeah, we had a fun discussion reliving that movie. And then our August episode, which I just recorded and will be up in August, is the 1993 film The Crush.
Mm.
Sarah joins me for that, and then we also have a new guest on the show, Courtney Enlow, and they just are both they both knock it out of the park. It's hilarious. Both that that one is a lot more laughter than the Indiana Jones film, where it's me and Christian and Jeremy just saying, "What the hell were they doing?"
That's just
But
sad
so
disappointment.
yeah, so two very different conversations, but I think both were a lot of fun. And at some point, I'm going to be on Beyond the Mouse in the next month or so to talk about Tangled,
Nice.
which we've been teasing for a while, and also share my Disney experience, which I finally got to have with my
Cool.
family. So,
Cool.
yeah, you're gonna hear a lot of me in the next couple of weeks. So
I'm still
sorry about that.
Craig and I have talked forever about finally doing a Beyond the Mouse on Roger Rabbit, so hopefully we're
Mm,
going to do one of those here in the near future. And then, depending on when you listen to this, Jeremy and Sarah and I recorded Sunset Boulevard at some point, which is an interesting discussion because they were both in the stage musical. So we're going to talk about comparisons between that and the original movie. And we've got a lot more stuff coming down the pike with classics as well. So we thank you for your support, and we're going to keep doing it because we love doing it. And once again, Front Row, you can find us at I don't think the website has changed yet. It's still the
I think so.
frontrowmoviereviews.com.
Yeah.
You can
That's
find
gonna
us
be the
on
running. That's gonna be the
I
running
know.
gag for us. Website hasn't changed, folks.
No, and you can find us on Facebook, iTunes, wherever you listen to podcasts. Just keep listening. We love doing it. So once again, I am Brandon Davis,
And I'm Lou Hare.
and we will see you in the front row.